Namaskar. I'm Anuradha from the Gnostic Center, Delhi. And I'll be sharing a few insights into Sri Aurobindo's educational philosophy. It is best that we turn to Sri Aurobindo's words to get an insight into how he thought about education and what he proposed. Whatever he proposed was later put into action by the mother at the ashram school, which was started by her in 1940s. So to gain a complete understanding, one must read what he has written, along with the conversations of the mother and her action in the school. Sri Aurobindo was a yogi, and before that, he was a revolutionary, a freedom fighter for India. In both these phases of his life, he emphasized the importance of education for a free India, for India to be free, not only politically, but psychologically, spiritually. And in the path of integral yoga, also education to prepare ourselves, both, or rather, in every aspect of our being, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. The system that Sri Aurobindo proposed later came to be known as integral education, because it leaves nothing out of its scope. As Sri Aurobindo has said elsewhere, all life is yoga. One could easily say all life is education from the viewpoint of integral education, because it is about integrating oneself and the society, the nation, the whole of humanity, from an evolutionary perspective, from the perspective of growth of consciousness. What does this mean? Let's take a look. As Sri Aurobindo has written, in India, there has been a tradition, if we look at the Vedic age, the rishis, who were the teachers, they were self-realized beings. Their teaching arose from this realization of the self as the divine and a union with the divine. They were yogis. And yet they were not distanced or cut off from the world, from life. The kings used to send the princes to these rishis for training, for education. And they spent many years living with the rishis, obviously not just learning meditation and inner practices, that as well, but also learning all the outer skills, be it warfare, be it administration, things to do with political or economics, skills. Everything was imparted by the rishis. And how could they do so unless they also had a mastery over outer knowledge, the outer being, the world? So Swarat and Samrat, mastery over oneself, being the foundation for mastery over the external life and world. Now, this is also at the core of Sri Aurobindo's educational philosophy. And to master oneself, first, one has to know oneself. So this journey of knowing oneself has to be an integral part of education, not as an add-on, but at the core of everything that the student engages in, the subjects that the student learns, the entire curriculum of the school or college, or education beyond school and college, parenting, everything. So let's first understand that education is not confined to schools, colleges, or educational institutes. Everything in life is education and can be education. So whosoever engages, whether for oneself, in growth of one's consciousness, one's mind, the emotional being, the body, coming in touch with the inner consciousness, is engaging in education. And when that education is aimed at this growth of consciousness, centered around the inner being, the growth of the soul, the evoking and coming forward of the soul, and the mind and the vital and the body being used as instruments to express that inner reality in life, to master life, to perfect life. So outer perfection based on inner perfection, world perfection based on self-perfection, then it is integral education, no matter what one is doing. So let me share a few passages from Sri Aurobindo to explain the context, the larger context in which this philosophy started getting explicated. I'll share my screen. This is a message that Sri Aurobindo gave in 1918, where he points out the extreme importance of education for building up a nation. He puts it at par with home rule, which is what India was fighting for at that time. Home rule and national education are two inseparable ideals, and none who follows the one can fail the other. We want not only a free India, but a great India. India taking worthily her place among the nations and giving to the life of humanity what she alone can give. And further, the principle of self-determination really means this, that within every living human creature, man, woman, and child, and equally within every distinct human collectivity, growing or grown, half developed or adult, there is a self, a being, which has the right to grow in its own way, to find itself, to make its life a full and a satisfied instrument, an image of its being. So you see, for true freedom and true democracy, Sri Aurobindo, during his revolutionary days, saw education as a powerful means to build up the nation, build it up emotionally, psychologically, physically. And therefore, in his revolutionary action, which was in the late 19th and early 20th century, he encouraged the youth to engage in activities, the youth who had come and joined the movement to free India, engage in activities which would build up their bodies, which would build up their minds, which would build up moral courage, and which would awaken the spirit within them. Because for Sri Aurobindo, India was not just a nation, a piece of land. It was and is the Divine Mother incarnate as the Divine Shakti with its own soul, and the youth and all Indians were to serve it, keeping their self-interest aside. And how do we come to that poise of that egolessness, where we are able to rise above our self-interest and serve a larger purpose? Only if we are prepared for it. And that preparation is not easy. It takes a lifetime. And what better way than education to do so? Elsewhere, he has said, and again I share my screen, India has seen always in man the individual, a soul, a portion of the divinity enwrapped in mind and body, a conscious manifestation in nature of the universal self and spirit. So she has seen this soul, the individual truly as the soul. And then she has distinguished and cultivated in him a mental and intellectual and ethical, dynamic and practical, aesthetic and hedonistic, vital and physical being. But all these have been seen as powers of a soul that manifests through them and grows with their growth. So the soul, yes, but also the outer instruments, but at the service of the soul. And then not just the individual, but also the larger collectivity. India has not understood by the nation or people an organized state or an armed and efficient community, all at the service of the national ego, but a great communal soul and life that has appeared in the whole and has manifested a nature of its own and a law of that nature, a swabhava and swadharma, and embodied it in its intellectual, aesthetic, ethical, dynamic, social, and political forms and culture. So the education is in this context, in the context of the evolution of the human being as a soul which has taken birth in matter and has to manifest its full potential through that body, through that mind, through that emotional being. And for that, all these faculties of the outer being, of the mind, of the emotional being, of the physical being, have to be developed systematically. And also the individual is part of a collectivity. And that collectivity has to also express its soul. And the individual and collectivity grow together. Therefore, it must be an education that for the individual will make its one central object the growth of the soul and its powers and possibilities. So for the individual, this will be the object. For the nation, will keep first in view the preservation, strengthening, and enrichment of the nation soul at its dharma, and raise both into powers of the life and ascending mind and soul of humanity. So both the individual growth and the growth of the nation, finally, at the service of the evolutionary purpose, the evolutionary push of the soul and mind of the humanity, which is ever evolving and rising up. And at no time will it lose the sight of man's highest object. What is this highest object? The awakening and development of his spiritual being. So this is the purpose of education in Sri Aurobindo's view. What do we generally target education towards today? It is towards earning degrees, getting ready for the job market. Now, these might be valid purposes, but these are kind of consequences, natural results. So if the soul is developed and along with the outer instruments are developed, there is no way that that kind of self-mastery and life mastery will not lead to a job if that is what I wish, or a business if that is what I wish, or any other vocation, or no vocation, whatever. So that is what is happening. And Sri Aurobindo foresaw this. And in fact, in a conversation in 1930s, vis-a-vis India's freedom, he said, India will get free, but what will she do with her freedom? Will it be Gundaraj? Because he saw that unless the mind of the nation is prepared, the moral being of the nation, the people is prepared, what will we do with this freedom? We will not be able to exercise it, to use it properly. And that is what we see happening today. And that's where it becomes so important to understand the educational philosophy of Sri Aurobindo and to put it into practice. So in these articles that were written between 1910 and 1920, Sri Aurobindo indicated how to go about it. And the first thing he emphasized was study of the human mind, whether it is a child or an adolescent or adult. He says the first thing is to study the human mind. Now, what we do is we stuff the human mind, but we don't study it. We don't know how it works. So any system of education founded on theories of academic perfection, but which ignores the instrument of study, will do more harm. So we may apply this theory, that theory, but without a proper understanding of what is the human mind, how does it function, what are its capacities, how can these capacities be trained. Sri Aurobindo has written articles on training of the mental faculties, how the senses are to be trained, how the moral being is to be trained. And this was in the beginning, like before he moved to Pondicherry, and a few articles afterwards. But if you read his other books, you will get more insight into how this thing developed and how he practiced it with the disciples. And that, as I said earlier, the mother further expanded it and made it so clear through her intervention in the school with the teachers and the students. And one has to turn to these to understand completely, or better rather. Completely is too much, but better. So he gives importance to the mind, and then he says the mental nature rests upon moral. If the mind is developed, but the moral is not, take the case of Ravan, for example. If the mental is developed, moral is not, what happens? Mind is used for all kinds of devious purposes. So the moral also has to be developed, not through imposing morals, but through suggesting and inviting, not to command or impose. And the best method is personal example. So for the parents, for educators, for teachers, to be a yogi, to teach by example rather than by instruction, daily converse and books. So actually integral education is primarily, first of all, for the educator. I have to engage in integral education for myself. Only then I can do it for somebody else. And also the physical consciousness, development of the body, because body is the instrument, the adhara. A divine life in a material world implies necessarily a union of the two ends of existence, the spiritual summit and the material base, integral. So this is what I wanted to present, a very, very brief insight into Sri Aurobindo's educational philosophy. And the two values he gives maximum importance to is freedom and perfection. So although he speaks of national education, but he makes it also clear later in his other writings that it cannot be a state education. There has to be scope for freedom. Freedom is most important. Not just freedom to a particular school or college, but within that, freedom to each individual to grow the way they want to. So this combination of freedom and a structure, freedom and discipline, that is just amazing to engage in and understand. And one cannot do it from the mind. It has to be done from the inner consciousness. You can try. One will always fail. It has to be done from the inner consciousness. So it comes back to the teacher. That is what is Sri Aurobindo's educational philosophy. Thank you.